Tenho a oportunidade de ouvir o nosso palestrante, da Conferência de Abertura, o professor AbdouMaliq Simone, que muito gentilmente veio até o Rio de Janeiro para fazer essa fala para nós, e me parece que, ainda que não de forma planejada, existe alguma relação muito interessante aí entre o trabalho do Beckman e o trabalho que o professor Simone tem produzido de certa forma, Então eu queria, com muito prazer, convidar o professor Simone para fazer a palestra de abertura nesse momento para nós aqui. Por favor. Mais uma vez, obrigado, professor Simone.
Thanks very much, Eric. Congratulations for your endurance over 30 years. It's always heartening to see something that is important progressively to last, to endure in these times, and especially an institute that has contributed such a great deal to the production of global urban knowledge. The people in this room that I've known for a long time really can testify how important the work of this institution has been. So before I start, I want to preface my remarks by saying that the geographies entailed in this presentation come from around 35 cities that I've worked in for many decades over in Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. I may say a few things about Salvador later on, but just to frame the remarks, and that I don't know a lot about Brazil or Latin America, so that my limitations those are my limitations. So the Afterlives of Southern Urbanism and Territorial Justice. So in a fundamental way, urbanity is largely instigated by the unruly, the turbulent, the unsalaried, the rambunctious, the irreverent, the reticent, generous, undisciplined, and so forth. And sometimes we tend to disattend to these kinds of aspects in terms of the constitution of urban life. Yet Euro-American notions of the human have long emphasized a progressive developmentalist trajectory of endless improvement and an enhanced capacity, that life is moving toward the fulfillment of some unbound human potential. Yet the implications of this conviction have been to intensify the turbulence of the world, to unsettle the ways of living of the majority world, and to engender vulnerabilities at a planetary scale. So, the notion that development is really some kind of essential violence that is being done to the majority of urban inhabitants. So in which the future is foreclosed, not primarily in terms of the threat of extinction, but an investment in foreseeability. In other words, to calculate the future and thus preempt it, to circumvent the eruptions that are the very temporality of the future. What Bernard Stiegler has called the way in which particular localized knowledge has been generalized to the scale of biospheric locality. And what he means by that is the way in which this upscaling is made possible is to reduce the terms of such knowledge to the kind of data that is amenable to computation, and the elimination of that which is not. So pattern recognition that's geared toward preemption, for example, the whole logic of surveillance of borders, surveillance of airports. And this time is reoriented to the number of steps that a program needs to reach completion. And space refers then to computational extra space or memory that is required for a specific function to execute a program. And this is coupled with increasingly enormous and really enormous expenditures of energy. So dominant knowledge no longer functions as knowledge, but rather information, which when circulated and imposed has the effect of reducing the capacities of all localities. It turns localities into points or identities along the same line, subject to measures of comparability and proportion, the more or less, with the subsequent fight to become more than what is lesser. And one sees this particularly within the attitudes of the majority itself, which fight hard to not be as poor as the next person. Always this sense of more or less. Understanding one's place in the world, always by making reference to that with which one is apparently not. At the same time, we know that technical operations are really important for urban life. They amplify the reverberations of diverse and intersecting matters, agendas, concerns, activities, calculations, affective intensities, and compositions that make it difficult for any single set of actors to unilaterally restructure the textures and uses of urban environments. Even, the big players, such as property developers, municipal governments, finance capitals, or mafias, they indeed are big players. But somehow the proliferation and the diversification of urban technicities provides some kind of intersection of different aspects of urban life that mean that in some sense generate a disposition which is in some ways very difficult for any of these big power players to unilaterally control, even though they go out of their way to do so. The illegibility then of many urban environments and their unruly surfaces make it difficult for any single actor to confidently assess the implications of their moves in relationship to it. The police may invade all kinds of different neighborhoods and districts. There may be surveillance technologies applied and deployed as a way to try to understand what everyone is doing. And that does take place, and that is a kind of debilitating process. But somehow cities remain replete with these unruly surfaces where it's difficult to really assess what happens if a total kind of incursion takes place. Even in the complete destruction of Gaza, it remains unknown exactly where Hamas actually does operate. So urban computation then extends a long existing dependency on blackness. For there is the question of what holds the urban in place. what holds its population's sensibilities, labor, economic, and symbolic coherence. So moving from the holds of ships transporting slave labor, the holds for the display and sale of black bodies, the apparatuses of mobilization on plantations, the architectures of mines, and the geological codifications of earth processes, all have underpinned the deployment of the fungibility of black and indigenous bodies. Here, black existence is converted into signifiers of exchangeable value that knows no limit, that instrumentalizes the human being's essential absence of defining characteristics and niches to become, through violence, a constantly refigured domain beyond what is instituted as the definitive human. And this process of fungibility, haunts the capacity of the urban to hold anything together as a coherent entity. No matter the technologies of surveillance, the lures of citizenship, the curated affective inclinations, the provisions of services and welfare by states, the agglomeration of economic functions and their forward and backward linkages across space, the city remains haunted by the violence necessary in order to ensure the scalability and consolidation of the plantation and mine as the critical motors of urbanization. At the same time, the urban is driven through the hyperproduction of commodified images and experiences, the intricate and nano-level assignation of values, the blurring of the material and immaterial, and relations of derivation which transgress any boundary, registering the discreteness of objects, temporalities, and territories. This, after all, is the logic of financialization. As such, the urban must constantly undermine the significations of whatever it produces to keep going. And this very possibility is established through blackness, which both refuses all identities, the very notion of identity, yet by default comes to stand for the possibility of something more than this refusal. And this something more, no matter how well defined in urban and regional planning, becomes something always already unattainable. So in a time of quantum physics, where locality does not entail physical proximity, the social congregation, or the region, the territory, is necessarily diffuse and shape-shifting. It always is at an edge. Power differentials will, of course, remain. Certain lives can be wasted at will. Yet the altogether, the notion of a kind of diffuse social congregation, far from connoting a human nature in the last instance, reflects a fundamental indeterminacy of what counts and what doesn't, even amid an unprecedented machinery of accounting. So despite all the histories of getting rid of things, of eliminating dangers, of expelling the apparently useless, of deciding what lives, what dies, and what simply is lifeless form, any habitat, any settlement, any urban district's lines of implications, its extensions across time and space, an unfolding of diverse logics and practices of making, posits a world where nothing can be counted out, as the out there becomes something more intimate, as compensation, possibility, and remainder. Yet at the same time, the same high-level computational powers that currently circumscribe our futures and contribute to climate crises also provide the means through which we come to understand the sheer immensity of these threatened environmental processes in the first place. And without these computational capacities, we would be even further behind in our ability to understand increasingly damaged environmental systems, and through them, we might well find solutions of some of the most pressing crises. So how does one think justice through such a conundrum? Where, as Bernard Stiegler says again, the technical is both poison and possibility. And that it's hard at times to separate what is poison and what is possibility. Now, in terms of the topic of the peripheries of capitalism, everyday life in the South is constantly impeded upon many, many different things, but I identify three things here. One, not only the relocation of factories, the return of primitive accumulation, the reascendance of extraction or the profusion of low-level service jobs, but also the reliance on the illicit as an instrument to configure articulations amongst different scales and territories. The importance of the illicit as a means of global articulation, particularly within the South. Secondly, the weaponization of the dissolution of social ties. Not just as I think you mentioned before about the tearing away of the social fabric. Not just this tearing away, but its very weaponization. Where the fragmentation of protocols of inheritance, the urbanization of rural areas, the acceleration of mobility, the loosening of family and communal mores, the undermining of extended kin relations, all connected, become modalities of warfare. Whereas circulation and proximity become the dominant metaphors of globalization, violence is used to create distance on the part of many territories. That is, to figure the inaccessible of that territory that's necessary to produce the illicit economies that are increasingly dependent upon as a way of generating livelihood. But violence is also used to create a sense of distance for a threatened public, whereby the public issues a threat itself, backed up by an armed privatization of public space and enforcement of tribute to local authorities. And three, the intensely racialized atmospheres of everyday life that's taking place nearly everywhere. And what racialization means, in some sense, is the arbitrary application of rules, the systematic undermining of an extraction from local economies enacted by the police, the omnipresence of security gazes, and the entrenchment of spatial segregation codes, all enforce specific bodies and spaces as perpetually in trouble. Perpetually in trouble. So racialization is in some ways generating this kind of atmosphere that whatever people do, it's trouble. And what does trouble need? Trouble needs the Chicago method. So the decentralization and diffusion of incarceration beyond the conventional prison model. So more and more, the jail is not the joint or the jail. It becomes a logic of trying to hold people in place, or letting people move and then targeting them as they move. So in some ways, it's no longer even necessary for a form of incarceration to be something that holds people, keeps people still. Rather, let them move all they want, but with all kinds of technicities. If their circulation becomes too dangerous, you can always take them out on the run. But it's important to continue to take the notion of popular territory seriously. Popular territory that's somehow self-produced, sometimes co-produced with various state and private actors, sometimes thoroughly reworked and rebuilt, sometimes the result of a social project, such as social housing, but in many cases redesigned in a significant way from an original intention. And so I have many slides that go into these notions of popular territories. I think I will skip, but just to say a few things. One is that popular territories are very difficult to generalize. They are so heterogeneous in their compositions, in their materiality, in their authority systems, in their governance, that it's very difficult to make generalizations. But if one could make generalizations, I would say that, and many popular territories are really deeply wounded, and many are completely eviscerated altogether, and many are deeply wounded. For those that continue to endure, their endurance is predicated, and again I say this more heuristically than in terms of empirical certainty. That is, their endurance entails the intersection of two things. First of all, that over time, their shared practice and activity, that is the inhabitants, their shared practices and activities with each other. Shared activities that rarely follow a particular kind of script, rarely are done through a kind of consensual deliberation, but rather a kind of continuous experimentation and improvisation, a kind of reciprocal responding to each other. That the products of that shared activity, that is, those territories produce something specific that is not easily translatable into the conventional terms of either institutional forms or efficacy. That is, it's not easy to read what's going on in terms of a kind of imposed language of efficacy or readability. Something is produced that is specific. And part of this is that when such territories were constituted, either in the way that I describe on this slide, that shared activity, people were not simply addressing those that were proximate to them. They weren't just addressing their neighbors. They weren't just addressing the local authorities that were emerging. They were also tacitly addressing everyone else who was also in the process of creating that territory, even if it wasn't explicit. So that in some ways a surface, a social and material surface is created, something specific that exceeds everyone's ability to precisely interpret what is taking place. First point. But second point, that in combination with that was the capacity to perform a kind of generic form, acting as something was in some ways being done by the book. That you had your distinct sectors, your well-defined institutions, your well-defined associations and forms of authority. That is a kind of play between that which is in reality something really specific and very difficult to read and very difficult to translate, at the same time performing as if one were able to be very transparent, to create the illusion, to create the image that of course everything going on is potentially interpretable, readable, and transparent. That the interplay of these two very distinct things, almost a kind of contradiction, to sustain that over time seems to me, having worked in many, many popular territories across the world, to be a critical element of their endurance. Not just something mysterious and opaque, not just something readable and transparent, and in some ways mimicking all of the kinds of formulas of what constitutes best practice, not just resistance, not just refusal, not just discernible social mobilizations, but in interplay of those two dynamics. Some amplified, some withdrawn, amplified at different times, which seems to be a kind of key aspect of their endurance. It doesn't mean that it's always going to work. There are externalities, of course, that also impede. Where is the popular territory located? How does it, in some sense, intersect with different kinds of agendas and interests on the part of the larger urban governing apparatus? But in some ways, why I emphasize this is that in some ways we have to think about the terms of endurance of popular territory in much more intricate ways in terms of our ability to engage with them, and not to jump too quickly to make judgments about when is it that we don't see resistance, when is it that when we don't see clear, effective institutional forms or associations. The absence of things doesn't necessarily mean the lack of things. So I will skip some of this. Just to make it another point about this is that the way in which popular territories also depended upon a kind of circulation and an absence of circulation. That is, the critical thing in terms of the production of these territories was to address the question, who are we for each other? Who are we for each other? We're not extended kin, we're not necessarily citizens, we're not, who are we? And then what is our responsibility to each other? How responsible are we to each other? And how much do we risk being indebted to each other? How far are we willing to go out of our way for each other? What do we mean to each other? And these are questions that were largely addressed in the very construction and infrastructure of the territories themselves, partly. That is, how do you create a kind of space of operation whereby people can circulate, ideas can circulate, experiences can circulate? I mean, if you have a particular vantage point in the rest of the city, if you have a particular job somewhere else, if you have a particular relationship with a particular organization, if you have a particular relationship with a hospital, and you a jail, and you the local municipality, and you the association of churches, how does that experience circulate within a territory which relies upon that knowledge in order to try to address the kind of structural vulnerable situations that territory faces in terms of legal status, in terms of police, in terms of apparatuses of control? How does that take place? It takes place through a certain kind of ability to circulate. But what does that circulation mean? How responsible are we to each other? What do we owe with each other? Who are we in each other's lives? And so the connective tissue across mobilities is often that of fungible bodies and lives of inhabitants whose residency always remains provisional despite any evidence of endurance. Things like insecurity of tenure, or the possibilities of eviction, or the possibilities of police intervention. But again, this is the dependency on the blackness of the city. And here I talk about a very important book by Neferti Tadiyar called Remainder Lives, whose practices and capacities are folded in as a vital infrastructure for the elaboration and reproduction of other lives worth living. And these fungible bodies constitute a critical substrate of support, service, compensation, and liquidity for the curation of viable aspirate urban existence. One that tends toward an artisanal sense of power, how to use the circulation through heterogeneous spaces to configure apparatuses of accumulation and attainment that circumvent any clear ideological orientation. Those who only have each other, and where that having entails a polyvalent sense of possession, holding, liminality, indebtedness, conversion, fugitivity, not property, that possession that is not property. So a kind of technicity and intermingling in diplomacy, of coaxing reciprocities and resourcefulness from the oscillating and continuous interactions of disparate places, patches, and actors within volatile conditions of precarity. Now, of course, one finds limitations to this kind of intermingling and diplomacy when particular regimes of authority take over popular territories and begin to act like a state that is not a state. So residents not only have to deal with one state, but they have to deal with multiple states, particularly a state that acts like a state that's not a state, but in fact is a state for that popular territory, and a formal state which is really not a state for that popular territory, but still is the kind of legitimate state. And those are the kinds of impositions of clarity, the impositions of definitiveness that somehow curtail these kinds of circulations, these kinds of intermingling, of technicity, intermingling, and diplomacy, reciprocities, and resourcefulness. They tend to impose particular kinds of strictures and definitions on that question, who are we for each other? Now, during the pandemic, the predominant ways of reading the entities of the urban, its compositional elements didn't quite get to what was taking place in face of marked upheavals. Now, for those of us who looked at this closely in Indonesia and India, we found that seemingly contradictory things were happening with greater intensity. Family ties were being solidified and falling apart, often within the same households. And in some cities, poor districts fared better than rich districts. Inhabitants were desperately holding on to their patch of territory as they were also dispersing across multiple patches. Social networks that had never been noticed before became visible across vastly divergent districts with seemingly nothing in common. Here, the accessible frameworks of social analysis, which accounted for access to resources and affordances in terms of class and social power, increasingly lost explanatory power in terms of who could get a hold of much-needed oxygen masks, hospital beds, and valuable information. It wasn't so much that the conventional social arrangements were structurally falling apart, as much as what was being made increasingly visible were other planes of operations. That notion of the specific that I was talking about before. That is, ways of gathering materials, resources, and bodies into collective entities that were hard to define or assign some history to, but which were marking differences among contexts that on every other usual social category seemed to be very much alike. I mean, what was interesting in Jakarta, in Greater Jakarta, was the death rates and the rates of hospitalization across poor districts that on every social indicator looked the same, looked to be the same. So I moved then to the next part of the talk, which was this notion of the afterlives. The afterlives of Southern urbanism. Now, there's been much recent discussion on the notion of afterlives, particularly in reference to slavery, indigeneity, and the colonial. On the one hand, afterlife refers to the consignment of a people to a fixed temporal and spatial position without recourse or consideration as to the ways in which a way of life transforms itself to become something else by virtue of its own inventiveness or practices of valuation. An inability to actively extend the sense of liveliness into the future. We're experiencing that now, particularly in the United States, where, to be black is to be black, to be a slave no matter what. On the other hand, by virtue of becoming a relic or exotic anachronism, all of those incipient potentialities, all of that which has been denied, all of the inventiveness and potentialities of a post-colonial or post-slave people to invent a new mode of existing in the world that's been denied, become a spectral presence, embodying a past that is not yet completed and a future that yet can be made from what might have been or what might be right now. That is, where the might be is not just what could come, but the might be that is already here. It's just that we don't have the language or the capacity or the positionality to recognize it and to know it. So these two senses of afterlives in which much of the urban South is positioned. Afterlife. The persistence of haunting questions as to the composition of the urban. Questions that don't go away. Questions that don't necessarily have obvious or ready answers, that linger across all policy regimes. For example, is what appear to be manifestations of normality really that? Or does what the normal, the accepted as viable, conceal some untoward acts of pretense or the masking of evil? Or are what appears to be manifestations of dysfunctionality, is it really dysfunctionality? Or is it competence and well-being masking itself as protection against really becoming the image it exudes, really becoming dysfunction? I mean, we know from colonial African cities that the way in which African districts were able to create some kind of space of autonomy was to show the white masters, look, we're really stupid. We're not really urban people. We really don't belong in this city, and we'll show you the extent to which we don't really belong in this city. But this was a ruse. It was a ruse in some ways, because if the white master saw all of this dysfunctionality, he or she was content to say, okay, the natives are all right. We don't have to worry about them because they're stupid. They don't know how to create or be in the city. So we won't give too much attention. Are what appear to be manifestations of extraordinary imagination or collective presence, are they really beyond comprehension? Or can it be subject to an accountable genealogy? Simply the extraordinary effects of essential everyday action and events, an unanticipated manifestation of the ordinary. So these are some, Afterlife also entails the sort of persistence of these kinds of haunting questions that are not easily answerable. If the Anthropocene registers the effect of a common humanity on the very conditions of existence, increasingly urbanization attempts to materialize that common humanity that through collective debt. That is, okay, the way in which common humanity gets created is that everyone is in debt, and that becomes what is common about something called humanity. For example, again in Jakarta, one of the ways in which popular territories are being intervened in is to say to its residents, look, we'll give you an asset. You want to own something? We're going to give you this 35 square meter apartment building, and with no money down. You don't have any money down. You just have to pay for the rest of your life. And then, but you'll have an asset. You'll have your property. You'll be in control. You'll own something. Now, they don't say that the building is probably not going to last for 10 or 15 years, but that's besides the point. You will still own this. So by folding people into new, often homogeneous built environments, affordable housing, often at the edge of things, where what they have in common is that they all owe. So humanity becomes common by virtue of being an indebted humanity, where residents have to pay forever. So then what are the conundrums of urban politics, especially as they relate to the increasingly differentiated poor and working classes, increasingly subsumed within the overarching notion of planetary inhabitants, collapsing distinctions among people in face of climate emergencies that supersede any other definitive conditions. So then an initial set of questions. How does configuring everyday spaces of operation entail an often down and dirty series of accommodations, brokering, wheeling and dealing, and trade-offs, aimed not so much to protect the integrity of specific identities or rights, but rather elaborate a worthiness of life based on the capacity to roll with the punches, to make something out of whatever presents itself, no matter how toxic it might appear. As the urban modernity imposed in post-colonial cities often emphasized the need for human development predicated on relinquishing what was perceived as the unruliness and incivility of the masses, how do port districts today attempt to recuperate a sense of the collective forms of living once valued as that capable of creating a real urban life? That is, how to dispense with the managerial without being conceptually confined as the criminal. I think, from what I understand, having been in Salvador for these last months, that this is a critical question. That is, everything that black residents within popular territories now do is seen as criminal because it emanates primarily from what the police interpret as this kind of unyielding conflict between First Command and Commander Ronaldo. So how do you operate within the interstices between the managerial and the criminal? The problem with so many projects of rectification or normalization is that they take place in an urban fabric of intense heterogeneity, both in the compositions of the built environment and social environment. Even for poor residents, their living situations and physical platforms vary widely, from self-built and makeshift wood constructions clinging to the sides of riverbanks, to densely crowded blocks of 3 to 4 story tenements to makeshift dormitory structures within abandoned warehouses and factories. For example, Penjaringan, Jakarta is a jumble of superblocks, high-end suburban estates, old stocks of social housing largely appropriated by lower middle-class households, even as all kinds of improvised arrangements are required to service flats with water and power, large swathes of well-built, stylish, multi-story residences, rows upon rows of combined residential commercial shophouses, as well as the modest, basically well-constructed two-story edifices that house working class or working poor families. The poor have an important degree of agency, not as humans who live whose lives pale in sufficiency compared to others whom they share a common district, but rather as a complex field of antagonisms and diverse interests in which the presence and action of the poor constitutes an important element in the working out of affordances, labor, strategic knowledge, and resources. That is, in a built-in social environment that's all over the place, that's composed of a lot of different actors and a lot of different money, how is it that they all in some ways interact? And the practices and methods don't come from the rich, they don't come from the middle class, they largely come from the poor. And while there are no guarantees against eviction, there are no guarantees against a massive remaking of the existing landscape, the intricacies of Penjaringan's interweaving of social and built environments has in most respects proven to be an effective shield to a wholesale uprooting of the life for most of the working poor in the district. Deeply embedded in multiple circuits of everyday economic exchange, it is this very embedding that offers limited guarantees rather than the amplification of the specific needs of the poor themselves, whom nobody really cares about anyway. In Jakarta, the word kampung, which roughly translates as village, has been stereotyped as village in the city. The reproduction of village mores as a means of social reproduction in an urban context that otherwise did not provide sufficient institutional resources for such social reproduction. The kampung was seen by the elite and middle class as concrete evidence that the majority of Jakarta's residents remained ineligible for real urban citizenship. In this imagination, the survival of the kampung has been predicated on the absence of any widespread collective sensibility of the characteristics and responsibility of an urban human. In other words, these were not residents capable of possessing themselves, of demonstrating propriety through regarding themselves as a property to be developed and maintained. But it's their very ineligibility. It's this very acting as improper subjects, which in some ways doesn't guarantee their endurance, but has contributed significantly to their endurance. And I can provide example after example of the way in which impropriety limits the kinds of incursions on the part of the state in terms to completely undermine the operations of these territories. The poor have long been vilified as something that must be kept apart, relegated to the kampung or the periphery, something not fully human in the terms that an urban elite and burgeoning middle class came to understand the human. And it's not that the poor necessarily refuse the sense of being human, but rather that the aspiration for human dignity and human necessity have often been mobilized to denigrate the very skills and capacities of the poor. That the very ways in which they attempt to do more than survive their bare human life is dismissed as insufficiently human. In other words, the poor come to refuse the refusal and thus implicitly expand the terrain of the human. Its ability to extend, even disappear across multiple relations with the more than human landscape or built environment. For example, you go into a neighborhood in a popular territory in Jakarta, and you go to a house, and you ask the people, where is your family located? Are they next door? Are they down the block? And families will also, once they trust you, take out a piece of paper, and they will draw all these lines that extend across vast territories in the greater Jakarta region, and then they will say, this is my household. This is not my house, this is they will sometimes call it a kind of way station or a kind of nodal point, but this ability to extend across that. So the family, the household is not this sort of identifiable, consolidated place, mommy, daddy, me, and the kids here in place, but rather it is something much more extensive, much more diffuse. So what might be viewed as toxic or self-destructive is revalorized as a work in progress. So recent years have witnessed the emphasis on extended urbanization. A lot of attention paid to extending the FEB's work on this, and simply the growth of urban regions. Jakarta itself is a city of 10 million. It has lost population in the last decade. It's now 9.5 million. But the region that it's a part of is 35 million. So, where's the real action taking place? In most instances now, probably not in the city itself, at least in Southeast Asia, but in the... You want to drive from Saigon and get to the countryside, well, it's a 2.5 hour drive. The city just keeps going. So where the expansion of industrial land, often at inflated prices, the relocation of the poor evicted from the urban core in near suburban areas, the rollout of large swathes of so-called affordable housing in varying vertical and horizontal forms, and the persistence of agricultural activity all sit in an uneasy contiguity, with rarely any clear lines of articulation amongst these domains. So to extend, if you look at the notion of what it means to extend is to not be held down, not to be fixed in place, not to live one's life in the whole. Seized, lured, secure, methods of being folded into some scheme, agenda, and debt. Not to be seized, not to be lured, not to be secured. Not to be in a situation where people are held up, interdicted, slowed down as a means of scrutinizing, assuring, benchmarking, or sorting. Where they are made available for certain kinds of labor, referencing and evaluations. As such, there are many wholes: the home, the factory, the bar, the church, the mosque, the club, etc. And where the difference between being held, like being held, intimate, being cared for, and being held, detained, is often blurred. We want to be held. We want that intimacy, we want that support, we want that care. But increasingly the difference between being held and cared for and being detained and incarcerated, we can still recognize it in our lives, but structurally that border becomes increasingly blurred. And so persons move across different holes, and the circulation itself brings different problematics, energies, resources into each hole, as they potentially destabilize them as well. All attempts to hold are punctuated by a certain waywardness, to use Cynthia Hartman's term, and based on her beautiful book, Wayward Lives. So all attempts to hold are punctuated by a certain waywardness. Consider the urban extensions, consider the peripheries and the suburbs and the hinterlands. This sense of waywardness is more scattered and ambiguous. The sheer heterogeneity of development at all scales, from thousands of small developers to large real estate corporations, have equipped regions with many warehouses, housing estates, mega residential developments, industrial zones, commercial centers, and small enterprise districts that either never got off the ground or only partially fulfilled their intention functions or desired rates of occupancy, or quickly fell apart. When these projects are coupled with large patches of squatter settlements, temporary migrant housing, and the conversion of older residential neighborhoods into mass boarding houses, it is possible to grasp the extensiveness of a circulating population that is emplaced across multiple tenuous residences. They remain often completely unanchored in serial short-term occupancies, or are continuously displaced as a function of different instantiations of urban renewal, the migration of employment opportunities, or the increasingly opportunistic sensibilities of residents themselves. All kinds of discrepant environments become momentary bastions of largely improvised collectivity, where people try to make some functional use of each other without any pretense of long-term commitments. Momentary, sporadic, and makeshift become the defining metaphors of many collective formations, what we might consider regions of blackness. Instead of the conceit of settling things once and for all, justice is the willingness to affirm an incompleteness. The sense that residents are not just holding on to some cherished ways of life. They're not just holding on to some tradition they can't do without, but are engaged in a continuous struggle to exercise the inventiveness of living. Struggling to not sort things out through calculations of equivalence or variation, about who gets this and who gets that and in what proportion. For everything at the periphery, and I'm using the word periphery now in its larger sense, is entangled in ways difficult to read as separable differences. That is, differences between what is occupied or unoccupied, what is viable or not viable, what distinguishes the short term from the long term, or even the settled from the unsettled. The question that Fred Moten, the African-American philosopher Fred Moten raises, is whether justice itself is inapplicable to apprehending the ways in which the eruption of normative trajectories, the tumultuous spilling out of life in wayward, inexplicable ways, is both the product of subjugation and of life's priority. That is both the result of being subjugated, but also of what Foucault talks about as life's priority. And that it is sometimes impossible to navigate and separate this distinction. That the very creation of the future, rather than being specific probabilities or scenarios of preemption, depends on its eruptive force, but an eruptive force which always risks dispossession. And if this is the case, who will be dispossessed and how? So the politics of inhabitation thus go beyond the restitutive and reparative logics of justice. It is something more spacious as life's expressiveness, or more precisely, the modalities through which life is activated to resist notions of fulfillment, sustainability, and property. As in life itself being a series of properties that have to be cultivated to maximize its value. This, after all, is at the heart of the neoliberal logic, treating one's life as if a property to be endlessly developed in a proper way. So here, politics is not directed toward either reversing dispossession or repossession, but rather using the moment of dispossession to prefigure or predispose the available unbodying of the dispossessed to forms of gathering, sensing, and living that do not fully complete the process of resocialization in the terms imposed by the mobilizations of political rule, infrastructure, accumulation, and territorial administration. Now again, I emphasize it doesn't mean that large volumes of awful violence are not brought to bear on resettling the dispossessed into new regimes of incapacity, but rather the trajectories of the dispossession can never be charted for sure. Yes, dispossession, being unsettled, is a traumatic and difficult thing, but it's also important to pay attention to the ways in which that dispossession gets to be used and spatialized and territorialized as prefiguring and predisposing the majority to new forms of inhabitation. New forms of inhabitation that might not be realizable, might be actualizable now, but which in Fanon's terms are a kind of non-actualized existence. That is, it's being set in motion. It's being implanted. It is there, but it not yet have the conditions to be completely activated and actualized. I will skip this. So reflecting Viveros de Castro's notion of many different natures within a single cultural construct, the way in which different domains become perspectives for each other, or as Denise Ferreira da Silva has talked about, differences without separability. I mean, if you look at sort of the logic of popular territories themselves, it is in some sense differences without separability. As soon as you begin to separate those differences, the logic of the popular territory in some ways is gone. So ways of living the urban in such a way that the church, for example, is the household for some, the household is the church for others, the market is the city hall, and the city hall the market, and so forth. Where commonality is not framed in terms of a set of specific definitional criteria and common participation in clearly defined contexts, but rather the simultaneity of multiple seemingly inverted perspectives which both maintain the separateness and inseparability. And then finally, a productive and necessary tension exists between carefully attending to the fragments of inhabitant struggles amidst enduring colonial legacies and creating alternative ways of narrating the endurance of black and brown life. So what a kind of, and in prior slides which I skipped, I talked about the popular territories as a kind of choreography. And part of that choreography is an interweaving of an archive that's bits and pieces of people's memories, people's materialities, the formation of a different kind of archive, a different kind of collective memory. And what choreography and thus that the archives might therefore offer is the feeling and sensing of collective ways of being together and the disavowal of processes that delegitimate while navigating fractures and uncertainty. How do you feel and sense a way, I mean, that sense of who are we to each other? It doesn't always have to be specified. the more it's specified sometimes, the more vulnerable it is to being broken and being attacked. How do you configure over time a kind of sense of collective affect, collective feeling, collective confidence that may not be actualizable, but you feel somehow that it exists? How do you sustain that? Well, knowing that you have to navigate a world and a territory and a city that's increasingly broken and increasingly uncertain. What is important is the way in which this points to movement. Not simply migration, mobility, and circulation, but movement as a critical force. As people, materials, landscapes, discourses, and other entities move with and across each other.
Com a fala do professor Simone. Então, está aberto para quem quiser fazer alguma intervenção, algum comentário, alguma pergunta. Nós temos aí ainda algum tempo para, enfim, para dialogar, né, com essa fala tão provocativa. Vamos fechar uma... Bem, a gente pode passar. Se você for o primeiro a levantar, a gente pode passar direto para você, enquanto os outros se animam. Só se identifica e fala perto do microfone para todo mundo.
Bom dia, obrigada. Meu nome é Carmen Rosane e eu sou doutoranda aqui no IPPUR. Faço parte também do coletivo de mulheres de favelas e periferias aqui no Rio de Janeiro. E o meu objeto de estudo, ele faz parte, né, é sobre o movimento social de mães. E, no caso, o meu objeto de estudo é o movimento social de mães nas favelas aqui no Rio de Janeiro, especificamente uma área da Zona Norte, uma favela que nós temos aqui no Rio de Janeiro, que é a favela de Manguinhos. E o movimento, e eu tenho muito proximidade com o seu trabalho, por conta do infraestrutura de pessoas. Eu utilizo muito, né, a partir até do seu objeto de estudo em Joanesburgo, e eu gostaria até de aproveitar essa oportunidade, já que você mencionou sobre resistência, práticas compartilhadas e atividades, e essa performance de forma genérica e genuína de justamente, né, dessa dinâmica amplificada no espaço, no tempo e nesse território. E eu gostaria, né, dessa oportunidade que você pudesse falar um pouco sobre a infraestrutura de pessoas, porque é justamente essa performance que as lideranças dos movimentos de mães utilizam justamente como uma resistência para superar a opressão da letalidade policial, da segurança pública, né? Então, para não me alongar mais, né, porque eu sei que outros podem querer, e depois eu gostaria de conversar mais a respeito. Obrigada pela oportunidade.
Mais alguém? Zé.
Muito obrigada pela fala e pelas provocações bastante instigantes, né? Eu acho que você deixa várias questões em aberto, né? Mas eu queria só contribuir um pouco para essa reflexão sobre as novas formas de violência que vem incidindo sobre os territórios populares e essa necessidade de afirmação da existência, né? Então eu acho que se num momento passado onde se tinha uma noção de ordem, de progresso e de desenvolvimento mais claras enquanto ideologia de poder, esses lugares, né, que aqui a gente identifica como favelas, territórios informais, eles eram também vistos como funcionais, né? De um lado, as populações também se fazia acreditar que em algum momento você tinha uma promessa de progresso que ia chegar, então essas pessoas um dia iam ser inseridas, mas por outro lado você tinha uma gestão de pessoas e de territórios considerando que essas pessoas eram funcionais para a geração de valor, né, para a produção de riqueza, necessidade de mão de obra, de trabalho. Então elas tinham, digamos que, um encaixe na sociedade que dava uma certa legitimidade para uma série de políticas de produção de moradia social, né, enfim, de uma certa perspectiva de integração. Agora, o neoliberalismo, né, ele implode completamente essas relações. E se de um lado ficam mais claras essas relações que você traz, né, que esses territórios eles existiam e se faziam existir por relações, digamos que incompreensíveis, né, por essa ordem que vem de fora, mas agora sua legitimidade de existência, ela cada vez menos existe, né, então permite essas variadas formas de acentuação da violência, né. Então a gente vê o exemplo extremo é o que está acontecendo em Gaza, né, mas a gente vê a acentuação da violência policial por todas as partes, né. Acho que isso que você quis dizer, se eu compreendi corretamente, que você não precisa mais levar as pessoas para a prisão, você pode matar elas ali mesmo, né. Mas por outro lado as pessoas precisam construir novas legitimidades de existência nesse mundo complexo. E aí você vê muito mais emergência, né, de movimentos sociais, de movimentos de luta, de movimentos por resistência que precisam afirmar uma existência popular. Você usa esse termo, né, de Afterlives, né, como se fosse depois da vida. Só que eu não entendi muito bem por que Afterlives, né, porque a gente tem uma certa urgência da vida agora, né, as pessoas existem, vivem, ocupam territórios e precisam lutar permanentemente por essa violência. Então, aqui no Brasil, a gente, na teoria, né, social brasileira, a gente sempre brigou muito contra esses enquadramentos de que aqui é o lugar da falta, né? Nós não somos ainda Europa, nós não somos ainda Los Angeles desenvolvidos, nós não somos ainda. E aí é uma briga muito forte para dizer o que nós somos agora, né? Então, nós existimos agora, o que nós somos agora, como nós construímos nossas relações de existência agora. E elas são sim permeadas por violência, mas a gente não pode esperar nenhum futuro, né? Então, a luta pela legitimidade, pela existência, ela é cotidiana e urgente, né? Então, essa ideia do after, né, do depois para o futuro, também é uma ideia que a gente combate aqui.
Simone, muito obrigado. Eu acho que a fala do Simone traz uma sensação, que acho que isso é transmitido de maneira muito forte, quer dizer, que essas especificidades todas que nós conhecemos ou tentamos conhecer e ler nas nossas cidades também são universais. Eu acho que essa é a primeira lição. E eu tive a oportunidade de vir em Jakarta e ver os kampungs e esse sentimento do específico diverso que é universal, e acho que a tua fala traz, e acho que é um ensinamento muito importante. Quer dizer, nós temos que tentar entender e ler o específico, sabendo que ele, num certo sentido, não é tão específico assim, mas ao mesmo tempo é singular e único. E dentro dessa especificidade universal, se a gente pode dizer assim, eu gostaria que você explorasse um pouco mais algo que está muito hoje no meu campo de preocupações, que é a ideia da dívida. Você colocou essa dívida como uma dimensão local e universal. E eu gostaria, se você pudesse explorar um pouco mais a ideia da dívida na vida cotidiana dos pobres. Porque os pobres hoje são universal e localmente endividados. E eu gostaria que você pudesse explorar um pouco mais essa ideia da dívida, que é financeira, mas não apenas, né? Tem uma dimensão financeira, mas acho que você quis dar uma outra concepção também de dívida que vai além da relação financeira. Então eu gostaria de você falar um pouco. Eu estou muito focado hoje em tentar entender essa dimensão da dívida na vida cotidiana, né? Lendo Lazarato, que talvez você conheça, o Maurício Lazarato, que trabalhou sobre essa produção do homem endividado, né? Do ser humano endividado. Bom, fico por aqui só para te provocar um pouco a falar um pouco mais sobre isso para nós.
Bem, obrigado. A gente pode passar para o professor Simone para ele fazer três respostas, né, pelo menos, enquanto a gente espera a próxima rodada de perguntas.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for these three important reflections. In terms of people as infrastructure, what's interesting is that this started as a joke. Actually, many years ago, it was a kind of throwaway concept that was issued to piss someone off at a conference, and then it sort of took a life. It sort of took a life of its own. So I've had to, in some ways, either defend it or to deny it or to qualify it for a very long time. But I think, I mean, if you look, for example, in Argentina, the work of Derogado and the feminist movement, the way in which, where is in terms of majority territories, where is social reproduction located? And the way within these neighborhoods, particularly with mothers' movements, feminist movements, the way in which social reproduction is something really distributed across different kinds of actors, different kinds of places, different kinds of functions, different kinds of lines of interconnection that continuously have to be renegotiated in fairly flexible ways. It's not everyone doing the same thing all the time. And it's not that those functions and practices are institutionalized according to a particular set of protocols or rules. They're always, in some sense, revised in order to maintain the efficacy of whatever is done. And these have to do with, in some ways, configuring relationships, particularly among women, that are amenable to this kind of renegotiation, that are amenable for women being able to do different kinds of functions. And that, in that way, constitutes a kind of infrastructure. In a night market in Jakarta, which supplies the basic fruit and vegetables and meats for all of the local markets across the region, that runs between 10 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning, completely improvised, every night. You have different kinds of jobs. You have people who have to drive the trucks you have to have people unload the trucks. You have to have people that carry them to the stalls. The stalls have to be sold out, have to be set up. The people have to sell things. The space has to be organized to where a particular stall is located. There has to be someone going around to collect the fees that are paying the people who are going to clean all of this up after everything is over. You have all these kinds of jobs that have to be done. But if you look at this market over the years, everyone, the person who sells from the stall, the person who collects the fees, the person who drives the truck, they have all done each other's jobs at one point in the operation of the market. Everyone has the capacity to do everyone else's job, so that in the performance of any particular job, They always have all the other jobs in mind, and they can have all the other jobs in mind because they've done all the other jobs. And so in some ways, they've had to, in some ways, configure these relationships amongst each other so that you can circulate through different kinds of jobs. The knowledge gets circulated through. This is in some way where the relationality becomes the infrastructure itself. Of course, you need the goods, you need the fruit, you need the vegetables, you need the street, you need the stalls, you need the trucks, you need all of that is infrastructure that's inseparable from this operation. But it's in a way in which the distinction between the material and the immaterial becomes in some ways blurred. What is the infrastructure there? The infrastructure is all of those relationships necessary to make that market work. And that market works not because it has certain kinds of overarching authorities, which in some ways specify what it is that everyone does. The market is a collective effort. And in some ways, that's what I'm getting at in terms of people's infrastructure. The thing about afterlives, I'm not saying that something's, I indicated two notions of afterlife. One is the persistence of forms of accumulation, plunder, extraction, racism, oppression, subjugation that have endured through time, no matter the regime in power, no matter, that these fundamental operations have a life that endures, that is an afterlife. That means seemingly the post-colonial situation was to, in some ways, guarantee the autonomy of different kinds of societies, particularly within the South, to pursue their own. No, there's the colonialism, despite the coloniality, despite post-colonialism, has this afterlife that endures and informs and structures. And therefore, all kinds of aspirations, all kinds of intelligences, all kinds of collective capacities, all kinds of resourcefulness that were being brought to life don't have an opportunity to really concretely manifest themselves. But they exist. And how do they exist? They exist as a kind of spectral force. It's what Fanon talks about in terms of this notion of a non-actualized existence. Something is brought to life in terms of the struggle of people against eviction, against oppression, against erasure. Something is brought to life. And if the eviction takes place, if the erasure takes place, if the incarceration takes place, it doesn't mean that that's the end of what is brought to life. It just exists in a different kind of way. Sometimes it has to go undercover. Somehow it has to dissimulate itself. It has to pretend. It has to hide behind things that are the opposite of what it seems to be. That's all I'm saying in terms of this notion of it doesn't mean that the present is not one that requires intense struggle, intense capacity, and tactical intelligence. It just means that the resourcefulness of that is not just to be found in terms of what UN Habitat will offer as best practice. It's not what all of the sort of international organizations offer as the terms of effective political efficacy. It means being able to draw upon that which is difficult to identify, but which in some ways continues to exist. If you look at Salvador, this really obscene city in many ways, one can see that the incredible attainments that were made by the black population over the past 60 years. In 60 years, they built popular neighborhoods that went from nothing there to every square inch filled with some kind of inhabitation. 60 years. And not only creating a kind of physical infrastructure, but creating a kind of collective capacity that at times could resist, could refuse, at other times produced really effective kinds of associations. At other times found itself completely unable. I mean, Salvador is an 80% black city, but it's such a white city, it's unbelievable. It's the whitest city in Brazil in some ways. Why is that? What's happening? The federal police, they now have established centers in 12 of the biggest, most important popular territories. Those outposts don't just exist to fight first command. They're not just there to interdict illicit economies. They're there to interrupt and intercept any activity on the part of local inhabitants to engage in undefined shared activity and shared practice. If you're going to church, that's one thing. But if you're going to a square to assemble on a Sunday afternoon for an informal gathering amongst all different kinds of residents, this is interdicted as something that is an unacceptable activity. So the federal police is not so much to shoot, criminals. It is to interrupt the manifestation of a shared practice and activity that's long been the essential ingredient in terms of creating the kind of collective intelligence and capacity of those popular territories. And in some sense, that's a crisis. But as residents in Santa Cruz will say, you can bring 15,000 police here if you want, but it's not going to destroy who we are. You can have those 15,000 police kill and take away all of us. It's not going to destroy who we are. That is that sense that there's something there to draw upon that may be very difficult, it may not be very discernible always, but it is this conviction. And in some ways that conviction, largely according to residents, rests on the surface of things. They will say, yes, we remember this place was a place where this samba school was, or this is the place where this samba association would meet to practice, but now since the police are there, they won't let us do it. That kind of traditional archive of memories, of things that happened, that's an important archive. But what people have said to us is the more important archive is the surface of this entire territory. Are you going to be able to precisely compute and identify and document exactly what this surface is? No. And it's in this surface which has been collectively built, not by all of us forming a mass organization, but in some sense, everyone for everyone that has done this, that constitutes this kind of a collective resource. It is an afterlife that is there, but maybe not being able to be turned into the terms of, well, let's get rid of this white regime that's been running the city for God knows how many decades. This is in the sense of what I mean. And in terms of debt, well, I can't improve on Mazzarato's notion of it, but I mean, if I look at in Jakarta over the years, there has been in some ways this concrescence, this consolidation of the sensibility of I consume, therefore I exist. That is, to consume something becomes the primary form and element for affirming one's existence. Because when people will say, I don't know where this shit is coming from. I don't know how to identify where the primary forces that really shape my life the way it is. It's just all over the place. I worked as an activist for 30 years, someone will say. I've tried to, work with all kinds of municipal authorities on housing, on better sewage, on, we've made some small improvement, but we're not getting anywhere, and I'm not quite sure exactly how to explain it. I mean, I know. The guy will say, "Listen, I'm a dedicated Marxist. I know it's capitalism, but give me a break. I need to know more, and I don't know all of the different trajectories of powers that are impacting on me." And it makes quite sense because those powers are much more heterogeneous, much more micro in some ways, even if the macrostructural dynamics of their everyday life remains the same. Consumption is the way that one feels that one has an existence. I got 5 motorbikes in my garage. I managed to get a color TV. I have something, and I have this something, and therefore I exist. But I didn't have the money up front to do it. It was through debt. And what kind of debt? Well, all kind of debt is being offered. The loan shark down the street, the person who offers a loan at 10% daily interest, the small microfinance projects that are everywhere that now enable people supposedly to improve their livelihoods and to start maybe micro businesses without a clue as to what it takes to really do it. So there's all kinds of ways in which debt is being availed. And so if you don't go into debt, who are you then? You must be someone really out of it because, so
87% of Brazilian families are in debt. 87%.
So, yeah, this is...
Ok, nós temos uma última oportunidade de fazer perguntas. Eu estou vendo uma mão ali. Soraya, então, por favor. Se ninguém for mais, eu faço a última e a gente fecha, porque está chegando a hora do almoço e a gente tem que voltar, não se esqueçam.
Obrigada, boa tarde. O nome é Massani e no ano passado eu concluí um mestrado aqui no MIT, né? E pesquisei sobre catadores, que fazem parte desse grande grupo de pessoas vulnerabilizadas, vamos dizer assim, né? Eu fico pensando aqui, professor, o senhor trouxe mostrou pra gente, né, que tanto aqui no Brasil como em outros lugares existe essa questão, né, dos contingentes de pessoas pobres e essa noção que eles acabam sendo confinados, às vezes até projetos de moradia que até visam em algum momento, né, uma melhoria, mas aí no fundo eles têm muitos problemas. A gente tem aqui o Minha Casa Minha Vida, que foi uma coisa pensada, né, para dar uma moradia digna para as pessoas, mas que acaba também tendo muitos problemas, como lugares distantes, né, não tem equipamento de saúde, não tem escola. E aí quando eu penso em toda a experiência que eu tive com os catadores, eu vi ali que tem muitos casos, são 3 gerações sendo catadores. E aí, assim, ser catador é digno, é um serviço ambiental de altíssimo valor, que se o Brasil não tivesse os catadores, a gente estaria, nós não temos programa de gerenciamento de resíduos, né? Estamos falando de transição energética e não fizemos dever de casa dos resíduos, que é a minha área de estudo. Mas, enfim, a gente encontra analfabetos e 3 gerações de catadores. E aí que eu fico me perguntando, por que 3 gerações de catadores ainda, né? Se é um trabalho exaustivo, que de a remuneração injusta, enfim, porque essas pessoas não conseguem fazer essa mobilidade social porque não conseguem ter acesso, por exemplo, à educação, que não tem outra forma, né? Não vejo outra forma. E aí fico pensando nisso que o senhor trouxe, nessa ideia de confinamento dos pobres, né? E se isso tudo, ao fim e ao cabo, não é guerra aos pobres, a porofobia, ou até o que o Achille fala da necropolítica, né? Quando ele olha para o continente africano. E o mais interessante de destacar é que não é só uma política da morte, mas é que ela é um ato contínuo que desembarcou na África com a colonização, né? Então, tanto na África como no Brasil, se o senhor vê que é isso, quer dizer, essa estrutura do confinamento, do não equipamento urbano, não acesso à educação, são estruturas de sufocamento dessa população e que, no fim de tudo, fico eu pensando, não sei se o senhor vai concordar, hoje em dia a elite tem falado muito nas smart cities, as cidades inteligentes, aí eu faço a pergunta, mas onde estão os pobres? Ah, não, aqui não vai ter pobre. Como é isso, esse milagrezinho de instalar dos dedos não vai ter pobreza? Eu fico imaginando que é uma espécie de arca de Noé, ou um lugar onde não tem pobreza, e aí eles precisam fazer antes o trabalho de matar os pobres, né? Então, se o senhor concorda com isso, que essa política do confinamento também é de sufocamento e, ao fim e ao cabo, da morte dessas pessoas, para que se alcance na elite a famosa cidade inteligente, onde tudo é maravilhoso, digital, tudo funciona e não tem pobreza.
Bom dia, professor AbdouMaliq. Prazer em ouvi-lo. Queria, primeiramente, deixar como sugestão um filme que está em cartaz atualmente aqui no Brasil, chamado Malês, sobre os malês, os escravizados muçulmanos trazidos para Salvador. O filme está em cartaz e esse filme fala de uma costura de engajamentos entre a população negra em Salvador, né, para que houvesse um levante contra as instituições dos brancos, né? E ouvindo a sua apresentação e pensando também na ideia da dívida, eu fico pensando que essa dívida ela não se deve apenas a um empréstimo, né? O empréstimo ele é um dispositivo dessa instituição dos brancos no mundo colonial, sobretudo. Então é uma dívida histórica que o filme também aborda e que a gente pode pensar juntos aqui nessa sessão. Fazendo pesquisa empírica no Rio de Janeiro, eu tive uma escuta para entender que a palavra comunidade, quando ela é invocada nas arenas públicas da cidade, diante de algum conflito, ela menciona uma comunidade destituídos de algo que está em disputa, né? E, claro, quando ela é invocada num aspecto positivo, é justamente para mostrar uma estética que não é hegemônica, que não circula nos espaços hegemônicos e que é produzida de forma compartilhada. Mas, no sentido negativo, né, a comunidade fala de algo que está sendo percebido como um direito, como você ressaltou. A justiça é uma afirmação de incompletude. Foi a sua fala, né, que me fez lembrar o uso da categoria comunidade nas arenas públicas cariocas. Então, eu gosto de me colocar sempre no lugar de uma reflexão interpretativa. Eu tenho dificuldade de pensar em soluções, acho que esse também não é o meu papel, né? Eu prefiro interpretar, acho que nós todos somos condenados a interpretar o mundo em que vivemos, né? Mais do que encontrar a solução, porque às vezes a solução ela não é implementável, não é viável, face às instituições, à linguagem, né, imposta para todos nós. Então é algo que a gente vai imaginando utopicamente. E por isso eu queria somente fazer esse comentário em diálogo com a sua apresentação e também pensando nessa dívida. Será que essas comunidades destituídas de lugar no mundo contemporâneo não estão dando uma nova perspectiva sobre essa noção de dívida? Na verdade, a sua humanidade comum endividada talvez reclame o reconhecimento de uma dívida para com elas, para com as condições existentes para a sua própria reprodução social, e não necessariamente a inserção num modelo de cidade, de um modo de vida, né, que lhes foi imposto. Então, é uma dívida moral, uma dívida histórica, diria até mesmo uma dívida estética, no sentido de consideração, de reconhecimento de outras possibilidades, modalidades e modos de ser e de viver, né, nas cidades que nós temos hoje. É somente um comentário que eu espero que possa provocar em você também as ideias que a sua fala provocou em mim. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Soraya. Bem, então é a última, porque a gente está estourando o tempo, tá?
Bom dia, professor. Muito obrigada pela sua palestra. Meu nome é Jane. Eu venho de São Paulo. Eu tenho visto aqui os colegas trazendo as questões que são voltadas para as comunidades aqui no Rio de Janeiro. E a minha colocação é exatamente no que nós vivemos em São Paulo, que traz muito também desse contexto de favelas, de favelização. Nós temos uma favela na verdade não, um distrito em São Paulo, que é o bairro Jardim Ângela, que ele, na década de 1990, ele foi considerado o lugar mais violento do mundo. E somente após movimentos sociais e a própria comunidade se mover para que houvesse algum tipo de benefício, de ajuda e de mudança daquela realidade, é que o poder público teve um olhar a partir disso. Então, nesse distrito, né, nessa comunidade que é o Jardim Ângela hoje, que embora seja considerado um bairro, ele é uma grande comunidade, lá houve uma reestruturação. Hoje não é mais considerado uma região tão violenta, deixou de ser a região mais violenta do mundo, porém outras regiões que igualmente têm violência, elas não são vistas. Então, o meu questionamento é no sentido de que precisa que o mundo inteiro enxergue essa violência, que se torne algo popular, que se torne algo que manche a imagem do país, para que o poder público tenha um olhar e possa fazer algo em benefício dessas pessoas, porque as outras comunidades elas não têm o mesmo olhar que o bairro Jardim Ângela teve naquele momento. Hoje já não tem mais. Hoje a própria comunidade é quem se move para que haja mudanças, para que haja melhorias para a própria população. Tá? Eu agradeço mais uma vez a sua palestra de hoje.
Bem, então vou aproveitar o gancho rapidinho para fazer a última pergunta. Eu fiquei muito interessado na ideia, você tentou dialogar com o tema geral das periferias do capitalismo, né? E a Gisele em algum momento mencionou a ideia um pouco assim que um certo slogan que existiu por muito tempo no Brasil, principalmente a ideia de que o Brasil é o país do futuro. Nós íamos nos tornar algo que nós não somos, e o futuro era alguma coisa parecida com a Europa, os Estados Unidos, alguma coisa do tipo. Bem, o tempo passou e nós não nos tornamos ainda, né? Talvez até que bom de certa forma, mas alguns autores começaram a criar uma provocação que é a seguinte: na verdade o Brasil é o país do futuro no sentido que ele representa o futuro do próprio centro do capitalismo, porque há uma certa precarização, né, da vida de muitas pessoas pobres também na Europa, nos Estados Unidos, sobretudo a população imigrante, né? Então uma certa brincadeira, talvez um pouco cruel, né, de que nós seríamos aquilo que, para onde o resto do mundo estaria indo, né, no sentido de que a gente não superaria nossas precariedades, né, e essas precariedades se espraiariam, ou seja, no sentido mais amplo, do sul global para o norte global, se você quiser, né, que você acha disso, dessa ideia de uma certa periferização do centro, né? E não um desenvolvimento que nos leva a nos equiparar ao centro, olhando do ponto de vista da periferia, né? Então, todas as questões que você colocou, em que medida elas também não estão se espraiando para outros lugares que não só o Sul Global? Um pouco isso. E mais uma vez agradecer.
I think there's a conundrum, a problematic. I mean, we all used to admire Brazil for its city statute, its progressive legal framework, the role of the state increasingly imposed upon everyday life in these territories, leaving residents and inhabitants with the problem of having to navigate through these kinds of regimes of authority which are counterposed to each other in a way that is away from this kind of heterogeneity, circulation of ideas and actors and functions and improvisations and authorities. That becomes a kind of mode of dispersal in terms of Brazil's relationship with the larger South. I think that you answered her question in some fundamental ways. Just to say that incompleteness is not insufficiency. It's not a matter of what something lacks. I mean, we all, the academic, the municipal business governor are always too quick to identify what is lacking in something. The psychoanalyst is always ready to tell us what we lack in terms of our own personal development. It's always about this notion of lack. But lack is not insufficiency. Rather, when I said incompleteness, I said the capacity to continuously build on the unanticipated implications of what it is that you are doing, how to take it into new directions, how to risk new forms of it being manifested, not to hold on to a kind of specific identity of something as that of which it is. Because the more you hold on to it, the more you're identified with it, the more you set yourself as a target to be, in some ways, wiped out. So endurance is about this kind. Endurance does, I think, depend on this notion of incompleteness. I think that in some ways the example of Sao Paulo and whether or not violence now has to be, I'm not sure, because I think in many situations, for some territories, in many different places, it doesn't matter how violent they are. People are indifferent to it in some ways. If you want to wipe yourself out, go right ahead. Be my guest. Is the kind of message oftentimes, unless somehow it's within the interest of the ruling regimes to mitigate such performances of violence in terms of branding their city, marketing their city, in terms of brand management is a big part of contemporary urban governance. So it's good to have these examples of where local social movements were able to. My concern oftentimes is that the modalities of restructuration actually in some ways facilitate greater displays of violence at times. How does that restructuration take place? What does it look like? What forms? Well, because sometimes restructuration means these kinds of provisioning of vertical social housing, which is a violent cut within the social fabric. It limits in terms of what people are able to do with each other, and becomes a kind of laboratory of social violence. Does it mean that residents aren't able to do something with the oppressive forms that they inherit? I once worked in Sarcelles, a suburb of France, where they provided this kind of big social housing. The residents took it apart from the inside and built something completely different. But they made sure that the outside looked as if it was still the same, that people were still living in individual apartments, and everyone was still a kind of incarcerated, captive audience, but inside something very... So they had to make an investment in this kind of dissimulation game of being able to do something different with what they were given, which didn't work for them. But so this is it's always a kind of intricate kind of performance. And yes, you know, the thing is that in your example about the catador, you're talking about, okay, I'm not, that is certainly evident in many instances. But when also Carlos talks about debt, there is a kind of debt that is used basically in terms of mobility as well. I mean, if you look at Kinshasa, which is the most fucked up city in the entire universe, it has more people living with less than 50 cents a day than any other urban region on earth. You know, a city of 18 million people with nothing, basically, where the state is completely non-existent. It's everyone for themselves. People will go into debt, not to hold on to their little shack in one neighborhood. They're going into debt to speculate on having some land over here because they think the city is moving in that direction, but they're not sure. And then they use a little bit of money to acquire land way out over here, and then way out over here. Now, in order to hold on to that land, they have to have some relative, you know, and pay them something to stay there, because if they don't stay there, that land is going to be stolen. So it's an indebtedness in terms of mobility in some ways. You don't stay in place. You spread yourself out. You have a sense of trying to read where the city is going, because if you read right, you might make a little bit of money. Not dissimilarly the way in which in many cities the number one enemy for the urban administration are motorcycle delivery drivers. In Karachi, enemy number one are these young men usually who drive motorbikes. Why are they enemy number one? Because they end up knowing the city better than anyone else. They know what things are weekly guarded and what is not. They know the change of shifts at the factories. They know when trucks are coming in so the state feels like, okay, this enemy number one. We have to crack down on motorcycle drivers because they know the city better than anyone else.
Ok, com isso a gente fecha a nossa mesa de abertura. Eu, mais uma vez, vou agradecer enormemente ao professor Simone por ter vindo até aqui e ter se disposto a fazer esse diálogo conosco. Foi muito intenso, muito provocativo, e acho que vamos levar aí essas reflexões para o resto da semana, né? Então, agradecer a plateia toda, você mais uma vez, os intérpretes, que são fundamentais aqui, né? E dizer para todo mundo para estar aqui de volta para as sessões temáticas às 1h30, ok?